Ambassador, welcome to Ukraine, to Kiev, and to our Hromadske studio. And I'll start here. You come into Ukraine from Afghanistan. How is it to be the ambassador in the country at war? What makes it different? And do you think, this is a very different place as Ukrainian thinks compared to Afghanistan, but what you already think could be the relevant, knowledge and experience for you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here at the Hromadske. It's super to be allowed to be your guest. And of course, as you say, the differences between Afghanistan and Ukraine are much bigger than the similarities. But there are a few things in common. One of them is that both countries are countries that are facing the challenge of having to reform while there is a conflict ongoing. And I think that is something which makes any reform work much more difficult. The second thing which strikes me as being similar is that both Afghanistan and Ukraine are countries in difficult neighborhoods with difficult neighbors who are making the work of reforming the country that much more cumbersome. And I think the third thing which comes to mind, the third similarity between Ukraine and Afghanistan that has struck me is the very high level of corruption in both countries, and how that is a problem which is really damaging development both in Afghanistan and in Ukraine. So those would be the similarities, but otherwise it's mostly differences.
And you already, one of the first trips were to Mariupol. What are the first impressions? And also you've been to the front line, yeah. So what are also your first impressions from Ukraine, also looking at this experience?
Yeah. Look, my visit to Mariupol was I think a bit of an eye-opener. Ukraine is of course a big country, and the conflict in a way can sometimes feel distant from Kiev. So I think it's extremely important for me to have had the opportunity to travel to the conflict line. And if you ask about what my major impressions from the visit are, it is simply the level of human suffering of the many Ukrainians who live close to the line of conflict. And I think it really is very important that the new leadership of Ukraine has made such a determined effort and has made clear its intention to improve the humanitarian situation for those living close to the conflict.
There are obvious priorities for any democratic, government coming to Ukraine as an embassy, like promoting rule of law, promoting human rights, promoting democracy. But what are maybe more precise priorities set up to you as new ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine?
Look, Sweden does a lot of things in Ukraine. We're heavily involved here as reform partners of the Ukrainian government. We're here as political partners of Ukraine. We have a lot of business interests. But at the same time, I think for me, it's quite simple to boil down what are the Swedish interests in Ukraine. And it comes down to two things, to be frank. The first one is to help Ukraine as much as we can to restore its territorial integrity and ensure its full sovereignty. And we do that primarily as members of the European Union. And what that means, for instance, is insisting that the EU maintain its policy of sanctions against Russia until the reason why those sanctions were once introduced no longer are there. And that, of course, means, among other things, a full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Our second priority in Ukraine is to assist in the reform process. Ukraine has huge challenges. It's made great progress in its 25 plus years since independence, but a lot of work remains in economic reform and fighting corruption and legal, judicial reform, and we try to be as helpful as we can to our Ukrainian partners in making those reforms successful.
Do you make it to catch up with the pace of the reforms, which are, for us, it's quite challenging, I should say, in particularly when we were complaining that it was too slow. Now there are a lot of people complaining too fast. There is no way to look at the laws which are, adopted by the parliament.
I arrived on the 2nd of September, so I don't feel the contrast between now and before the change in government. Overall, we're very encouraged by the determination of the Ukrainian leadership to move forward with reforms. Now, having said that, you do point to one thing which seems to be a fact of life currently in Ukraine, which is this extremely high pace of reforms. Parliament is working in the famous turbo regime, and I think there's sort of two things here which would be important not only for the Swedish government as partners of Ukraine, but also which appears to me to be important to Swedish businesses who are working in Ukraine. And that is, number one, the importance of communication and consultation, so that the lawmakers and the government have an open dialogue with Ukrainian civil society, with media, with foreign partners, to explain their policies. And the second thing is to be clear about the long-term reform goals. And this is something where I think that the Ukrainian government could arguably do even more in terms of explaining its long-term economic policies, so that businesses and international partners and civil society have clarity on where the government is heading with economic reforms. But overall, it's a positive picture.
But for instance, now a lot of international investors and also foreign governments express their concern that, for instance, long-awaited land reform suggests that most possibly foreigners won't buy the land. Or it's not like suggesting. We talked to some people in the Servant of the People Party. They're in favor, but they want to make a referendum. And we know that public opinion is against of that. To what extent that is a concern for you?
The first thing I'd say about land reform is that it is a hugely complex and at the same time an extremely important reform. There is such great potential in Ukrainian agriculture, which demands reform in order to be fully realized. But the second thing I'd say is that land reform in any country is extremely complex, because it's not only about economic issues, it's about the attachment to the land, which is something which is important in any country. And I think maybe in particular in Ukraine, in view of its history, both in the 90s and earlier in the 20th century. So as a foreigner, I would be careful to have any very fixed recommendations as how Ukrainians should deal with land reform. But I will say one thing. There's a number of Swedish investors who have done a huge work in the Ukrainian agriculture sector to employ Ukrainians, invested heavily in increasing the productivity of the land that they work on. And I think it will be very important that Ukraine make sure that however the land reform is carried out, that it is done in a way that those foreign companies who've been here working in Ukrainian agriculture for many years, that their investments are safeguarded and that their interest is safeguarded and that there are no retroactive laws being put in place.
How you generally describe for viewers the presence of the Swedish business here in Ukraine? As we understand, for instance, there are some more symbolic things. So for many internationals would be a surprise that neither IKEA or a retailer like H&M aren't existing here. For instance, they do in Russia, which for a lot of Ukrainians, the country considered to be more corrupt than Ukraine. How do you see that? How you also explain that? Any plans with that? So.
Look, first of all, H&M is in Ukraine. They have 3 shops in Kiev.
I mean, I understand they are there, but they're still too small compared to any other. It's good that they're started, but they're really too small compared to what you usually have in any European capital.
Look, first of all, there's many Swedish companies in Ukraine, and they're active in everything from industry to renewable energy to retail to IT. IT is an extremely dynamic part of the Ukrainian economy. So there's a broad Swedish business presence here. At the same time, as you mentioned, IKEA is not here. Now, I'm not a spokesperson for IKEA. They make their own decisions, so that's up to them to answer those questions. But I will say one thing. Look, let's face it. There are serious problems with the business and investment climate in Ukraine. There's serious problems with corruption. There's serious problems with both in the judiciary and in other institutions. So I know for a fact that IKEA has a very strong interest in establishing a presence in Ukraine, and I think they're working as much as they can in that direction. But the question isn't really primarily for foreign representatives. I think the question should be asked to Ukrainian authorities themselves. Why aren't these companies here even more than they already are?
By the way, after the forum and during the forum, Investment Forum in Mariupol, which was aimed to explain that also invest to the region, which is very close, some kilometers away from the front line. Do you think it changed something? This is even like symbolic gestures from the government, because you may think that like unless you reform the judiciary, all these nice forums, maybe they don't really make that much sense.
I think everything is necessary. I think legislation is necessary, but I think it's also extremely useful that while the government is working to reform, which it is doing very actively, and that's something we very much support, I do think it's important that the government also works to communicate about Ukraine and to spread a proper image about the many strengths that are there in the Ukrainian economy. Take Mariupol, for example. I think in recent years, Mariupol has been most famous for being close to the conflict, for being close to the contact line. Mariupol suffered terribly under the conflict. But at the same time, there's another side to Mariupol. There's a Swedish company called Beetroot, which has a wonderful IT presence in Mariupol. It's employing a lot of people. They're extremely positive about the developments. And I think it's very welcome that the Ukrainian government is making such efforts to show that all the good stories that are there in Ukraine. And I think Mariupol is one of those.
You mentioned that Sweden supports Ukraine also as the country which work with the sanctions against Russia, which is connected to the war. At the same time, now one of the big discussion is the construction of the Nord Stream 2, which Ukrainians are very concerned, both the society but also the government, because besides many would say this contradicts the EU goals of the. It increases dependency of the European Union on Russia, but at the same time, also symbolically, it looks like the countries which are our allies still do the business with Russia, which had been proven to be, let's say, not always ethical, and Russia uses the gas and oil as their weapon as well. We know that here. How would you explain that Sweden is more or less also agreed that the Nord Stream 2 happens? And that would be maybe a bigger question by the people rather than like, we keep the sanctions.
I fully understand that Nord Stream is an extremely controversial issue in Ukraine. And just to be very clear on one point, Sweden does not support Nord Stream. In 2018, the Swedish government received an application from Nord Stream 2 for permission to lay pipelines that would go through the exclusive economic zone. Now, when our authorities received that application, we studied it from the point of view of legality. Does the application apply with international law? Does the application apply with Swedish national law? And we came to the conclusion that there was no legal possibility for Sweden to deny this application, since it was absolutely in line with law. So for Sweden, there was not a question of denying this permission, but that is not the same thing as saying that Sweden supports Nord Stream 2. However, I would say that for Sweden, it is absolutely crucial that international relations, both economic and political, be based on international law. And so if that is something that we preach to the rest of the world, then of course it is something which we also need to apply at home.
Another hard issue is we've seen, and I think that I can thank you for speaking for the support of the Crimean political prisoners. You also, in your public online appearance, supported the the activity for the solidarity of the detained journalist Stanislav Aseyev in the Donbas. Of course, there is some movement because Ukrainians are happy that this year there were the political prisoners freed. We're speaking about the people like Alexei, so the others are still there. But what it feels that there is very little way the international community today can do in order to force Russia to free the political prisoners. We're speaking about the dozens, up to close to the hundreds of the Crimean Tatars detained in occupied Crimea and in Russia, mainly with the political accusations. It don't really lead to something. How do you think we can operate in this world? What do you think could be done also by the countries who stand for the human rights?
I very much agree with you that Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea is a huge problem, and I think it's a problem which the world needs to have patience and remain very firm in the face of this problem going forward. And I think one of the most important things we can do is to ensure that there's no creeping normalization of this illegal annexation. The European Union has sanctions in place in response to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. And it's something which we bring up in our political dialogue with Russia. Certainly, Sweden's position is that those sanctions must remain in place until the reason why they were introduced are no longer there. And in the case of Crimea, of course, that means the restoration of Ukraine's control over Crimea and Sevastopol. But I think we also need to be aware that this is a problem which is not going to become solved particularly soon. So I think it's extremely important that Ukraine and its international partners have a very long-term approach to the issue. And there, I think, bringing it up in the public, in media, in our political dialogue with Russia, and to take every opportunity to remind ourselves and the world that Crimea is illegally occupied by Russia. I think that is extremely important.
Sweden is kind of declared the female foreign policy. What does it mean?
Yeah. So look, the feminist foreign policy is a policy which puts at its center the need to ensure that women enjoy equal rights, equal political representation, and equal economic resources as men. That's the basis of the feminist foreign policy.
How you pursue that? What are you doing with that?
So we do it in basically every sphere of our activity. So if you're looking, for instance, at our development cooperation, at our reform cooperation, we do it by making sure that all the projects, all the programs that we have in place, for instance, in our cooperation with a country like Ukraine, contribute to ensuring that those goals of rights representation and resources are somehow pursued. So to take the example of our work with the Ukrainian Finance Ministry, we're working very closely with them on gender budgeting. Now, what that means is quite simply that when the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance sit and plan for the needs which need to be met through the Ukrainian budget, that those needs are clearly analyzed from the point of view of the needs of women and the needs of men, and that those needs are both properly met. That is one very clear example. It can mean, for instance, what will building this bridge mean for the women in town X? What will it mean for the men in town X? Another example could be our support to civil society organizations which promote the right and the political rights of women. Another example could be in our political dialogue with our counterparts, for instance, in Ukraine, to ensure that electoral reform is done in a way to ensure that in the future we will have a more equal representation of women and men in Ukrainian politics, for instance. So the way we see it, the feminist foreign policy is something which we can imply in almost every sphere. Another one could be the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Lots of studies have shown that conflicts which are resolved in a way that involves both women and men in the areas which are affected by that conflict those types of agreement have a much higher chance of surviving over time than peace agreements which only involve men. So that's another example. So basically, there's only the imagination sets limits to how much you can pursue a feminist foreign policy.
How successful were you in pursuing female foreign policy in Afghanistan?
Again, even in Afghanistan, we do feminist foreign policy and everything we do. So, for instance, we give a lot of support to developing the educational system in Afghanistan. And since the fall of the Taliban, the proportion of Afghan girls who go to school has risen from practically nothing to a third. That's still way less than it should be, but at least it's a huge improvement from what it was. So that's one example, education.
Did you receive kind of a critique from the larger part of the society for that, or? No,
I didn't. I know that there is a debate in society, but I can tell you one thing: Sweden was never criticized for pursuing the rights of Afghan girls to an education, and I would seriously like to see the person who would be bold enough to come out into the open and say that girls should not have an education. So no, I've never met such criticism.
You know, the Taliban, which was for some time considered the terrorist group which nobody could talk to. And later we understood that there are talks with the Taliban members. There is some way of not just containment, but kind of talking to them. And I think that the Ukrainians don't really know about that because, of course, we have in mind our conflict and saying, like, you don't talk to the terrorists, you don't talk to these kind of the people. What was the discussion in the Afghan society? Because it's quite a recent phenomenon.
I think at the end of the day, no conflict can be resolved without dialogue. I doubt whether it is often a productive policy to say that we refuse to talk to X, we refuse to talk to Y. So I think talking to your opponent in a conflict is not the same thing as accepting the means that opponent applies. And I think that is the foundation, that idea is the foundation of the dialogue ongoing with the Taliban. Talking to them does not mean that one accepts the methods that they use.
But were there a lot of controversy in the society? How it was discussed?
There was a lot of debate, lots of debate. But my sense is that most Afghans whom I spoke to and interacted with agreed that dialogue was necessary in order to end the conflict.
Greta Thunberg, who is a really world-star celebrity fighting for avoiding climate crisis. But how she is seen inside of Sweden? Do you think that the Swedes consider her like the Swedish ambassador? And how also you think like the Sweden can build on her recognition globally? Not every country has such a young celebrity.
Look, I haven't read any studies of the level of Greta Thunberg's popularity in Sweden, so I have no answer to your question. But it would surprise me if she didn't enjoy a very high level of public support in Sweden, because in Sweden, I think there is a very wide and broad recognition that climate change is arguably the number one challenge facing all humans on the planet today. And that is certainly also the position of the Swedish government. Now, I think one of the things that is remarkable about Greta Thunberg is that she grasps the width of the challenge. She understands that this issue will not be resolved unless there is very strong cooperation between governments and civil society, bringing in business and really creating a global coalition determined to fight climate change. And so I think that's one reason why she has become such a successful champion for the fight against climate change.
So how you think what you can, and Sweden as a country also can do with that already, like as I mentioned, recognition and popularity, in order to do it here in Ukraine?
Look, climate change is at the forefront of Swedish policy in Ukraine as well. Energy efficiency is one of the areas that we're working very hard to support Ukraine in increasing. Ukraine is infamous for being one of Europe's least energy efficient countries. If Ukraine were to increase its energy efficiency, it would not only reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, it would also reduce its dependence on imported Russian gas. So I think there's a very strong both environmental and security argument for increased energy efficiency in Ukraine. And the good story is that since the level of Ukrainian energy efficiency is so low, there are huge gains that can be made by improving it.
So after these few months you're here, what are the main impressions? What are the main takeaways? It's not a long time so far, yet something already to mention.
Well, a few takeaways are the very strong determination of Ukrainians to create a successful Ukraine. I think that is one key takeaway that I take with me. Another one is the strong determination of Ukraine's current leadership to pursue reforms. That's another thing which has really struck me since I got here. Another thing which has really struck me is the engagement of Ukrainian civil society, of Ukrainian debate, and the openness and the freedom of debate, which is part of the policy process in Ukraine. That's another great strength, I believe, of Ukrainian society. Another thing which might seem sort of silly, but has struck me is how incredibly good the food is in Ukraine.
Oh yeah.
And I'm mentioning it not because it was a big surprise, but it's something I hadn't thought of before I came here. And I don't think I've ever been in a country where I've had so much good and so varied food as in Ukraine. So that's also a big plus.